Good morning, everyone. It's a bad start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the District of Squamish special business meeting for Tuesday, November 2nd. We're privileged to be meeting today on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. Hatsqualin, Queesluknumuk, Squamish, Okameo. May I have a motion to adopt the agenda? Moved by Councillor Herford, seconded by Councillor French. Any opposed? Motion carries. First up, under staff reports, is our visitor and camping management plan. This is our end of season report. Ms. Brown is here, our visitor management coordinator. Mr. Pagely is online. And so am I turning over to you, Mr. Pagely, or to Ms. Brown?
I'll be presenting this morning.
Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, Mary Ellett, members of council and the viewing community. My name is Dan Pagely, the Acting General Manager of Community Services. Joining me, as mentioned this morning, is Ms. Stephanie Brown, our Visitor Camping Seasonal Coordinator, who's contributed a great deal to this project in a number of ways. And specifically, I'd like to acknowledge her great work in data collection and organizing the results in the tables that we're about to see in this report. As well, I'd like to acknowledge Ms. Keely Kinner, who started the project with us and who was a catalyst to several of the non-policy tactics and strategies that were introduced this season. Next slide, please. This morning, I'm here to provide council an end-of-season report and recommendations regarding education, enforcement activities, and learnings emanating from the visitor and camping management season 2021. Next slide, please. We will do a brief review of the background, how we arrived here, speak high level to some of the key findings. Then we'll start to drill down into data collection, benchmarking that will allow council to make data-driven decisions. We'll talk about the solid work and collaboration of the roundtable, look at the measured approach through our bylaw enforcement team. Education was also a big part of that. Achievements and learnings, and finally recommendations, and welcome feedback and questions. Next slide, please. To begin with, we thought we'd share this slide with you. This particular slide represents the volume of garbage collected from our public cans over a period of several months. We felt it was an interesting graph to share. This was done through the solid work of through the technology and finance teams, the data that they were able to bring forward, and Stephanie was able to extrapolate and build this graph for you. This is just one example of how we were able to track volume of activities within the district. What we do not do here is we don't differentiate between local and visitor traffic. As we know that it's the volume of activity in the corridor that is important, that brings particular challenges. We used such data as vehicle counts, so secondary data, camping availability throughout the 700 plus spots in the community. As you see, the amount of garbage that was collected through our operations department, our destination steward reports through Tourism Squamish, and RCMP and bylaw calls for service. And we'll speak a little bit more about those as we get into the details of the report. Next slide, please. As we mentioned in our mid-season report, increased traffic can lead to a number of things, including environmental impacts such as human waste, excessive garbage, potential destruction of sensitive wildlife habitats. And we also felt we were on the right track with our communication, education, enforcement strategies as necessary tools to help mitigate these particular impacts by seasonal visitation. We also acknowledged at that time that a longer-term solution will be needed as we bring all the partners and stakeholders together that are involved in visitor management throughout the quarter. And we'll speak to this a little bit later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. Key findings. As I mentioned, we'll just introduce some of the high-level findings, and we'll drill down into these later on into the report. But going into the season, there was a sense that litter and noise, human waste, fires, congregation, congestion, traffic, or crowds would be the main themes of some of our concerns. Through our data collection and analysis, it became apparent that noise was less of an issue or a concern, and largely campfires were not that much of an issue. Much of this was for campfires related to solid messaging with our internal and external stakeholders, and education with our CPOs and enforcement staff. Again, as I mentioned, we'll drill down into some of the details in these high-level themes later on in the report. Next slide, please. Before I speak to this slide, I just wanted to also acknowledge when we talked about some of the high-level themes and where the issues were, we identified Black Bear Road later in the summer, and we believe part of that is attributed to potential dispersion from folks in our sort of priority patrol areas. And we're going to look a little bit deeper into that as we get into the off-season, that particular area. Excuse me, I'm just going to catch up to the slides. This particular pie graph gives us a breakdown of the complaints. And in total, we had 89 complaints received between May 21st and September 1st. Now, just to clarify, those were just partial May and very little of September. We just captured the long weekend for Labor Day. So staff tracked complaints by residents as they pertain to visitor management related issues under the specific bylaws. We felt that was important just to show where these complaints landed and which bylaws or tools we used to be part of the education and enforcement process. It became evident that in August, our complaints that were logged were at a peak, and they spiked at about 39 with that particular month. Also to be noted that this particular graph represents only 17% of the complaints received during the same period for overall bylaw concerns. So I'll just repeat that again. So visitor management issues only made up 17% of total complaints received by bylaw through this season. And just to maybe reiterate what those three bylaws particularly were, those tools that we used, parks use bylaw particularly was related to right to shelter, temporary sheltering, camping bylaw was in place to protect sensitive areas and traffic related to sleeping in public roadways and vehicles, excuse me. Next slide, please. Now, this next slide, I must admit, is over my technical knowledge. So I'm going to just introduce it, and I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Brown to talk a little bit more about the potential of data collection using this particular tool. We thought this would be an interesting graph to show, or photo to show with you regarding what we refer to as a collector app. Staff, and particularly Ms. Brown, worked with our GIS team to start the implementation of this tool. This particular tool was easily added to the community patrol officers' phones, so they're able to collect data while out on patrol. This would include in-person conversations, as well as cases where they dropped off educational material, pamphlets that our communications department was instrumental in creating, and just generally meeting people out and about. So I'll stop there. Maybe just turn this over to Ms. Brown to maybe expand a little bit about the potential of this tool.
Thank you, Mr. Pagely. The Collector app is an application that was already in use by the Public Works Department for items such as fire hydrant inspections. And so it was something the IT department was already familiar with and could work. What they were able to do was kind of cater it. We created the menu that the CPOs, the community patrol officers, would have access to when they were out in the field. So the idea is that it's really simple. It's not convoluted or complicated. It doesn't require a lot of details, but it can capture enough details that it's useful both for us in visitor management for data collection, but also to the CPOs. They used it as well for parking enforcement. That's not represented in this image, but when they were using it for parking, they were able to take a photo of a license plate, mark down the license plate number. So each one of these yellow circles is a capture point. And if we were live in the app, you would be able to go and click on each circle to get the small, simple details of that capture in the field. This is something that we put into play sort of midsummer. I feel that it has a lot more potential with a bit more lead time. And by the end of the summer, the CPOs were pretty comfortable with using this app.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So the data that was collected that we spoke to in regards to the complaints was provided through Civic Web. And we just wanted to emphasize that, and you have this in your report, that the data can be distilled down to some very detailed information talking about the specific bylaw, the neighborhood, compliance time, resolution, etc. And all of that is tracked. And again, we'll be sharing that in the slides to count. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, we had a number of sources of input in regards to the data. And this particular secondary data, it's important that it talks about specifically the volume of activity in the corridor. And we're grateful for Flinro's ability to share this with us, tracking activity in Upper Squamish Valley. You can see where activity grew fairly quickly. One of the things that should be noted in this particular slide is that through August, as the public health orders shifted and people were allowed to go beyond the regional health districts, we suspect, it's not conclusive, that early in May, where people were restricted to their health regions, the traffic was much more evident coming up through the corridor from the lower mainland. But as people were able to travel a little further abroad, it leveled off, still suggesting a significant volume of traffic coming up through this area. Next slide, please. Collaboration and the roundtable. This is another strategy that was a non-policy that was introduced earlier on in the program. And we felt that there was a significant amount of success that was gained through collaborating and communicating amongst the various stakeholders. We had broken this down into 2 separate meeting groups. Now at times there was obviously overlap with our internal group meeting with the external group, but our internal group was made up of bylaw, public works, RCMP, fire, recreation, and communications. And these folks would meet bi-weekly and look at consistent messaging, addressing issues, looking at creative solutions, and just making sure we are all working off the same page when it comes to the issues that are impacting the community. That also translated, that same concept also translated into our external roundtable. And it's important that we acknowledge all of these groups, internal and external, in particular our organizations that are supported by volunteers. As you can see, there's a number of them there, and they all contributed throughout the summer to the learnings and the shared messaging. So I just want to acknowledge and thank those folks for being part of this group. And we'll talk about that group in the next slide as it comes to the off season. The external group had their final meeting near the end of the year, and it was evident that they enjoyed working with each other and sharing with each other and felt there was value in that type of forum. We merged members from the internal group into creating a off-season or year-round roundtable group. And this particular group felt that it would be best to take a look at the learnings themselves, look at where we can be proactive in our planning approach, especially, as you know, there's a number of stakeholders, as you see there, they have their own individual plans. So we thought it would be good to look at where organizational plans intersect or where there are gaps, and we can identify those gaps and look at strategies that we can work together on. Another outcome of this was that it was clear that we need to also build on strategies to identify how we can mitigate or support the visitor dispersion as people start to come up to the corridor. There's a fair bit of impact on what we refer to as front country camping and people wanting to be closer to the amenities where they're coming to visit or participate in recreational activities. And one of the offshoots from this particular group is that we will put a task force, or there's a task force together to look at how we can expand on creating more front country camping, low amenity, low cost opportunities for our visitors as they come up the corridor. Also to this group, we recently added SARS, the 99 Trials, the Trails Society and Wildlife BC will be joining us as we start into our off-season approach. A special note is that we will be actually scheduling a planning session November 18th with this group led by our own Megan Latimer, Emergency Program Coordinator, and the group was excited to spend time together to start to build a collective, cohesive approach to visitor camping management for 2022 and beyond. Next slide, please. Seasonal directed and education enforcement. This has been probably the single most important piece of how we approach this with our enforcement strategies. Of note, we had over 400 educational contacts that were made by our community patrol officers while out of patrol. This was primarily around building awareness, which led to compliance and overall improved social cohesion. Again, this measured approach seemed to yield positive results. At the end of the day, we only issued one ticket for non-compliance. This was an individual that had a number of opportunities that we educated them on, and at the end was not working, so we did issue an actual ticket for that. Next slide, please. Compliance time. And this speaks to the important front-end work that was carried out by our CPOs in the field around awareness and education. You can see that the majority of our contacts or incidents or concerns that were brought to our attention were resolved within 48 hours. Now, what's not noted on this graph is that, on this pie chart, is that 50% of the complaints, for example, if we received one in the evening, after hours, when the officer went to that site to explore the issue, the individuals had moved on or was resolved. So they were gone on arrival when they arrived. So, but those that were still there, the majority was addressed within the 2 days. And now some of those were done over 2 days because we were working with the individuals to try to find options and give them a period of time to pack up and to move on to more appropriate places for overnight camping. Next slide, please.
Mr. Pagely, I'm just mindful of time. So
Yep.
could we wrap up in the next few minutes so there's time for questions?
Absolutely. Achievements and learning. I'll be quick here. It's fairly straightforward. We've talked about a number of the learnings. I won't repeat what's on this particular slide. Next slide, please. And finally, Council received the Visitor Camping Management Plan 2021 end of season report for information, and I welcome feedback and questions. Thank you. Sorry for going a little bit over time.
Thank you for the presentation, and nice to have you here in Council Chambers, Ms. Brown. Council Hertford has a question.
Thank you. On the slide where you had the numbers for various weekends, you suggested, and it may well be right, that was restrictions or relaxing of restrictions that drove the numbers down on August long weekend. But I remember it being a torrential downpour, and that particularly on Friday, or that week leading up to. So I think the weather could even be a stronger driver. And I just wondered if our partners were collecting at other points, or this was just a historical busy time, and that's why we went with that number, because I don't think that really represents sort of my lived experience with the volume over through August. Is there any more detail with that point?
So this particular source of data was probably the most consistent historical information that we were able to put together to show the growth year over year. There are other points of data where trail counters, etc., but we felt this is probably the most overarching piece that demonstrated the volume year over year.
Go ahead, Ms. Brown.
Just to clarify on your question, you were asking about the vehicle counts and maybe what other factors involved in that number that we received?
Yeah, I suppose, or also if those counts are available for other weekends, or if it was a focused effort to get that data just for the August long in sort of anticipation of a benchmarking, but that very well could be a situation where the following weekend actually got more volume than the long weekend where we expected it. But so I'm just sort of curious about that anomaly, because it does feel like a dip, and maybe taken over time in the next few years, we'll see that was it'll sort of come out, but with the lack of being so early in the data collection, I guess I'm just curious about what the options are for that piece, and if there's data from the weekend before or after to sort of that sort of thing. How available is that data, I guess?
That data is secondary data from FLINRO, and they do collect that on long weekends. So they have it historically for the past few years for May, Canada Day when it's a weekend, and the August long weekend.
Thank you. And then on the image with the sort of the hotspots, like where you captured it, that was really interesting piece. But I was curious, one of the sort of at the onset of this project was one of the hotspots was the Malcolm Forest Service Road adjacent to the chief. And on the chart that was presented, I didn't see any, and that again doesn't quite match with what I expected to see, which is why we're here to all learn. But also, I just wondered if you could speak to that that area.
Certainly, that screenshot is literally just that. It's the data taken from that moment of what I had up on the screen at the moment. One of the advantages of Collector is that you can sort it. You can pick, to show everything that's ever been collected, or you can pick a date range. So for that specific example, it was literally just what was showing that day.
Did you have anything to add, Mr. Pagely, to that?
No, I was going to just ask for Stephanie to clarify that, but also on figure 5 in the report, it does drill down to some of the specific areas, and you can see there was very few incidents on that particular area that Councillor Herberg was referring to. As regards to complaints. Thank you.
Brown.
So just as a reminder, the graphs that were included in the report were based on the 89 complaints received by bylaw. So that's from the complaint-driven approach of enforcement. The CPOs were also out on patrol, and the Malcolm Forest Service Road was a regular area of patrol, regardless of whether we received complaints on that one or not. As there aren't any residents in that area, it tended to be low as far as complaints went, but there were issues in the area.
Go ahead, Councillor Anderson, and Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. Mr. Page and Ms. Brown, my question will be addressing Squamish Nation collaboration, but I'd like to start with highlighting in the report where you discuss Squamish Visitor Management Roundtable and the looking at proactive strategies, including visitor dispersion. Now, you refer specifically to campsites in that section, but my question is around river access. A few years ago, I was given a tour by a Squamish Nation peacekeeper and the late Paul Russell, who was a river access, kayak access advocate. They brought to my attention that we are lacking in river access for rafting, but also for fishing. And one of the issues is that the access is only available often through Squamish Nation reserves. And one of them under some pressure is Checkmas Reserve number 11, where, for example, at the north end at the mouth of the Pilchuck is definitely a hot spot as far as Squamish Nation is concerned for illegal camping and this sort of thing. But I guess my question is does this arise as a topic? We do see it mentioned as regards the park in Brackendale at the foot of Judd Road, but is river access a topic in itself in addition to campsites, access for fishing, rafting, canoeing, kayaking? And related to that, is Squamish Nation, our Squamish Nation partners working in tandem to build a map of these pressures on river access, for example, through the use of the Collector app? So my general question, collaboration with Squamish Nation in particular regarding river access points that become hotspots. Thank you.
Through the chair to Councillor Anderson, specifically that particular topic was not spoke or discussed in detail with the external roundtable, but I made a note as we move into the off season and we collaborate with the various stakeholders. This will be something we'll bring up around access to river, and Squamish Nations will be participating in that part of the report. And I asked Ms. Brown if she has anything else to add.
The year-round visitor management roundtable, which we've just sort of expanded, is now including a representative from the Malcolm River Access Society. So I trust that that issue is going to come up a little bit. It hasn't so far, but with this new member, I do suspect it will.
Thank you. I'll just follow up with another quick question, if I may, Mayor Elliott, and this is regarding tracking. There is reference to tracking your educational contacts, your personal encounters, but you also refer to the website and the social media. Are you tracking all of the above so that we can check on how we're doing with those social media messaging strategies and channels? Thank you.
Through the chair, I will ask Ms. Brown to speak to that if there's anything she can add.
So the communications department has kept track of certain statistics, including unique visits to when they post about visitor messaging. As well, at the mid-season report, we talked about the QR code about public washrooms. So they kept track of unique visits to that website as well. We don't have hard numbers with regard to tracking the social media aspect of things. I can speak to the personal contacts that the CPOs were making. So before Collector app was in use, they were taking handwritten notes about, spoke to a couple at Brennan Park, for example, and they would submit that, and was included in the count. Another reason why Collector app was a lot simpler was we could skip the step of submitting it to me. I could just check in on it. Does that answer your question?
Go ahead, Councillor Stoner, and then I've got Councillor Race.
Thank you. Through the chair, I'm curious, first of all, in terms of the ability to get compliance, do we have a sense of whether those folks were able to find space in a campground, for example, or if they were just moved on and kind of dispersed to another location? Do we have any of that sort of data?
Through the chair to Councillor Stoner, we don't have that specific data in regards to once compliance was in place on that particular site. Intuitively, as I mentioned, we may find that some of those areas that we talked about late in the summer, Black Bear Road, et cetera, may have been impacted because of dispersion from some of the areas that we're involved in. But I do know that our information that was shared with each of the folks would address where the options were for camping, so they were made aware of what was available to them.
And then just to follow up on that, I know that we have the app that shows where there are campsites available throughout the year. I wonder if we can use that at any point and kind of overlay. I'm just curious if there was like the times when we had increased enforcement action and trying to move people along to campsites, if there were actual campsites available.
Through the chair, Council Stoner, that's an excellent point. I think I made a note here for future reference. We can look at an overlay around peak complaints or concerns where we're dealing with visitor camping management, and then the availability that correlates with that. So thank you for that comment.
That's it for now. Thanks, Mayor.
Councillor Race.
I am not able to hear Councillor Race. I'm not sure if Mr. Pagely can or not.
Through the chair, I could not hear Councillor Race.
Can you hear me now? That was the first thing I said on the other microphone, so I don't think I'd wore the battery out already. But anyway, I was interested in the comment about the roundtable and the work that they might do this winter on additional opportunities in the front country for camping. And I wondered if you could maybe just add a little detail to that. Is there some kind of a commitment from the province, for example, to assist in that? And the other thing that comes up is, I know from my time on the regional district board that this is really a corridor-wide problem. And are we engaging other partners such as the regional district staff and Whistler and Pemberton? This issue goes up beyond Joffrey and Darcy. So I wondered if you could comment on that, please. Thank you.
Through the chair to Councilor Ray. So two parts to your question asking for comments. The first one, in regards to the additional low amenity campsites and opportunities, that particular topic has been actually brought forward to Parliamentary Secretary Green through Mayor Elliott and some of other councillors at a particular meeting through UBCM. And so Parliamentary Secretary Green has advised us that there are representatives in the district through BC Parks and Blood Road that will be part of that task force to look at solutions for front country low amenity additional campsites. Does that address your first point?
It does, I guess. Is there any kind of a timeline for that, or where we might start looking first, or are there going to be funds to, once sites are identified, to improve them to make them suitable for camping?
The timeline will start with this month's planning exercise, and then from there we'll be able to identify, I guess, next step strategies, including resourcing. So at this point, we're about to start the planning exercise in a couple of weeks with that group. And I apologize, I slightly lost your second point there. I just want to make sure I don't miss it.
The second point was around the regional aspect of it. And are we doing this ourselves, or is this sort of a regional initiative? Because I think the problem exists all the way through the region.
Thank you for reminding me. Yes, this is a regional initiative. So the regional district, the nation, Tourist Squamish, Glenroe, BC Parks, Conservation, et cetera, will all be at the table this off season.
Councillor Pettengill.
Yes, thank you. So in terms of the complaints, do we have a sense of how many are distinct individuals versus repeat? So those 89, for example, complaints, does that reflect 10 people or does that reflect 89 people?
Through the chair to Councillor Pettengill, I will ask Ms. Brown to see if she can respond to that question first.
I'd only be able to answer that anecdotally from conversations with the CPOs. They did have quite a few repeat conversations, but I got the impression that it was sort of half were repeat conversations and half were new. And each weekend we would get new people up as well that were to be educated. Does that answer your question? It wasn't one small core group of people that weren't following the rules. It carried over.
Okay, thank you. And then we was a bit surprised to see that noise didn't turn out to be an issue associated with the camping. Did we look when we were doing the education and so on to see if there were litter issues sort of, at the same time, or was that not observed either?
So the CPOs and the bylaw team were in communication with operations in the event that a cleanup was necessary. So what would happen is the CPOs would be out, they would educate and often offer a timeline. They would say, for example, we'll be back in 48 hours. In that time, you need to have cleared up and please, clear the site. And I was quite pleased when I would go back and follow up on status updates in Civic Web to see that when they revisited the site, often the cleanup was complete. In cases where it wasn't, then operations would be dispatched to go in and do the cleanup.
And I guess I'm actually sort of wondering more if there's a sense of when there's a vehicle or a campsite, was there sort of litter strewn around? So not so much, tents that would have been left, but just people sort of obvious garbage left around that pretty obviously wouldn't have been dealt with if someone had left it. Was there any sort of sense of that either way?
Again, I can speak to that anecdotally from my own experience. I went up to see the Black Bear Road campers from time to time, just to observe. I wasn't making contact with them. And what I found was that litter was minimal. It got to be it grew through the weeks. and, a little bit turns into a lot pretty quickly. It never turned into a whole lot. What I found was people were generally respectful.
Okay, thank you. And I guess I believe I'd asked previously, hoping to see an understanding of who the campers were. I mean, we have a hypothesis that the majority of our challenge is seasonal visitors. I'm just wondering, did you do any data collection about who are the people that we're interacting with? And if not, is there something we can do to start collecting that?
So I'll answer that in two parts. Firstly, for example, the destination stewards with Tourism Squamish, when they were out and about in the community having conversations, they were making notes of whether people were visitors or locals, roughly. So we have a little bit of data as far as who's out and about in the community. With regard to enforcement, they weren't separating the data that way. It was simply who needed to be educated about the rules. They did log license plate numbers. So I suppose it would be possible to go back and search to see the frequency and follow up on where those license plates might be from. But at the time, in real time, we were not distinguishing between somebody who was passing through or somebody who might be staying for a longer period of time.
Okay, just a comment, I guess that's something that, I believe I'd hoped to see or asked about before, and something I would still like to see. It seems that, we had some hypotheses about what's going on, what some of the impacts in terms of noise and litter are, and noise, at least hypothesis, seems to not be holding. And so I would like to understand those other things to know, are we investing towards solving the problems we think we're solving and in the most effective way? And for me, that's an important piece of data to understand. So I hope we will be able to capture that more completely. Thank you.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Thank you, through the chair. I'm not sure if that's what Councillor Pettingill was trying to get at in terms of one of his questions, but with regards to the complaints, the 89 complaints, do we know if those are repeat complainers or if they're like individual? Is it 89 individuals, or is it, as Councillor Pettingill said, 10 people who complained 8 times?
Through the chair, I defer that to Ms. Brown. I believe she started answering that, so I'll maybe just let you further clarify if they were just 89 individuals or repeat folks.
So to answer that, when I was tracking the information, I was specifically not paying attention to who was making the complaints. Now, having said that, there was an issue came up where it came to our attention that there was a resident who had made multiple complaints. And investigating that particular resident, what we found was that the complaints covered a very broad spectrum of issues. There were complaints about noise and parking and wildlife and camping. And that was a bit of a standout person because of the number of complaints that they make to bylaw. They're very passionate about rule following in their community. But for the most part, those 89, I got the impression that, perhaps there were, I would say 2 or 3 who made multiple, and by multiple, I mean 2, maybe 3 complaints, but overall they were unique.
That's helpful. And then I have another question, which you might not have an answer to, which is totally fine because this is a bit off the cuff. But in terms of the amount of resources that were, so Mr. Paisley mentioned that this represents about 17% of our bylaw complaints. In terms of like resource allocation, does it seem like it's a proportional amount of resources that we're putting to those 17% of complaints, or are there other components of bylaw enforcement that we should be considering, given that it's such a relatively small percentage?
Right. Through the chair to Councillor Stoner, thank you for asking that question. As we noted, that was 70% of the overall complaints to the bylaw department throughout that period, but that does not capture the over 400 contact points that the community patrol officers made to hopefully mitigate, and through education and awareness, complaints. So that complaints are only part of the picture. Does that help, Councillor Stoner?
Go ahead, Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about the meeting schedule from here on out amongst the roundtable. So when will the roundtable start to meet to prepare for the 2022 season? Is that going to start fairly soon or April 25th?
Through the chair to Councillor French, thank you for asking that. So they've had their first, what we would call off-season meeting this past month, and November 18th will kick off their strategic planning session. So we want to get a jump on this and make sure that we're ready for spring of 2022.
Okay, and then following up on that, is there some kind of regularly scheduled meeting day and time, or will the group just meet as needed between now and the start of the next season?
Through the chair to Councillor French, there is monthly scheduled meetings that are already in the calendars.
Great, thanks, Mayor.
Mr. Pagely, one of the things that Director Rainbow and I and Chris Lewis from the Nation at the time identified at the beginning of the season was the lack of sort of comprehensive data from all of our partners. So Tourism Squamish was collecting some, Flynn Road's collecting some, BC Parks has some, we've got some. So is part of, part of the advocacy the local governments can do relies on having good data. And I'm just wondering if that conversation about what we're collecting and how it creates a bigger picture, whether that is coming together through this off-season work.
Thank you, Mary Ellen, for asking that question. I've just made a note of that point also, but absolutely data collection to provide hopefully a holistic picture and provide evidence that would support our asks and needs in the quarter is part of the planning session, and what tools we can look at and how we can bring that together will be discussed.
Ms. Brown?
So the data that has been collected I have brought it all into one document. It hasn't been analyzed per se for comparison, but it is in one central spot. So we can look at visitor numbers to the parks, and we can look at trail counts, and we can look at vehicle counts, and that it is all in one central document.
That's a great start. And I think just working with our partners to identify the gaps, and then also the consistency of data collection so that we can compare our data to what the tourism ambassadors are collecting, because there were some differences there. We weren't asking about, are you a resident, or are you visiting, or for how long, but they might have been. So just making sure that we've got a consistent and fulsome picture, because that really helps us advocate for what we need in this corridor. But it's great to see the number of contacts made and the education component. I certainly got fewer emails this summer, but which is great. But that's not to say we don't have more work to do. And I think my colleagues have pointed out areas where they're curious about, and the who and the how, and the uniqueness of the complaints or the education versus repetitive contacts with the same people. Okay, any other questions? All right, seeing none, I know there is a budget ask that we've discussed. So now we have the background to finish those conversations in the budget meeting. And Ms. Brown, thanks for joining us today. Councilor Race is moving receipt. Seconded by Councilor Herford. Any further comments? Seeing none, any opposed? Motion carries. All right, we have recess until we'll go to 10 past the hour. Welcome back, everyone. We're in our special business meeting. We're on item 3.2, our 2022-2026 financial plan. I like that these now have themes. We're tying it all together. So this is our council last kick at the can here before we approve something to go out for public engagement. And I will turn it over to Mr. Russell.
And I will turn it over to Ms. Glenday.
Thank you, Mayor Elliott and Council and members of the public that are watching. Just wanted to provide a brief introduction to today's budget meeting, tying it all together. So as Council and the viewing public know, we've had a number of workshops on different elements of the budget, including questions from Council and some valuable feedback. And today is the day that staff have tied it all together, and we look forward to your questions. Staff will be presenting primarily just the changes as opposed to running through the entire budget again, and then look forward to some robust discussion with Council. We're also looking forward to our formal public engagement on November 23rd, and of course, the public can continue to email us and engage on Let's Talk Squamish. Before I turn it back over to staff, I do want to say thank you very much to our CFO and Mr. Russell and all of our budget managers that have worked really quite hard and diligently to get the budget to where it's at. I do believe this is the earliest we have presented to Council, and it's exciting to know that we can meet our goal of the end of December, all things considered. So back to staff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Glenday. My name is Roland Russell. I'm Senior Financial Analyst, District of Squamish, and with me is our CFO, Heather Boxrud. This morning, we will present a package of slides and information which ties our budget workshops together and presents an overview, so to speak, of the changes and recommendations that Council has made. And if I get my technology going, it'll go to the next slide. There we go. So it states that this is a general fund workshop, but in fact, it's more of a financial plan workshop because we are also including items related to the utility funds. You will note that we had a number of workshops, starting with non-discretionary and service level changes, operating projects, capital projects, utility funds. Included in this package, you will see there are the items referred to budget over the year and also council inquiries. So with respect to the general fund, the end of the year, well, it's not the end of the year, but at the end of our budget process, we've added everything together, all the changes that have been recommended. And right now we're looking at a increase of 4.06%, which equates to $91 per year for the average residential property. And you can see on this slide, we've broken down these amounts into the various groupings or components related to growth, inflation, capital construction. You'll note that special operating projects are going down and capital projects are going up. So just on an overall basis, did test the math, and it does add to $91. With respect to service level changes, there's 3 or 4 service level changes that we've provided additional information in your package, specifically with respect to the Public Safety Services Review. There was a change in the request from the RSMP because somebody's fingers weren't quite as touchy on the keyboard yesterday when they were updating this slide as they could be, and I missed the spell check piece to change that to RCMP. But the request was changed from an additional RCMP member to additional staff support. In addition to that, other service level changes were made and are outlined in your package. There was an increase in funding for affordable housing. There was some wording changes and additional information provided to council with respect to community event support. There was a presentation, I believe, at the last meeting. And in addition to that, there's some additional information that was provided around school safety zones. Lastly, there was a request at the last council meeting with respect to budget to include an amount for youth council admin support. We have included an amount of $25,000. It notes that there's a council decision required, and that is because at the end of the day, this amount is not included in the totals in your package. It was, there was the request, raise that, the request was to provide information of what this would require and what amount of dollars would be. So here it is, it's $25,000, approximately 1% or 0.1%, or just under $2 for the average household. Further on this, other service level changes that we wanted to note is that per council direction, we have included in future years municipal offices lease 2025, transit maintenance facility 2026. With respect to projects, we have added special projects and capital project, and we have incorporated the non-market change of 3%. With respect to capital projects, we want to highlight that we have a grant application outstanding that we are awaiting information on. With respect to the BPRC revitalization, which is our major project that we've added for 2022, we would also like to point out that as a request of council, we've included the Adventure Center hot water tank project in, I believe, 2024, which is going to address some GHG concerns. With respect to my next slide, there we go. With respect to our next slide, with special operating projects, we have added 4 special operating projects. We added a project related to economic development, which is grant funded. We have added projects related to public engagement with respect to the real estate facilities master plan, which is tax funded. We have a request for a CAC policy review to be reinstated. That is also tax funded, and a request to include the parking utilization study, which will be funded from the off-street parking reserve. Okay. With respect to the utilities, there was a council request to leave the small tote fee at $200, so no increase. We have included a 5% increase for landfill tipping fees for solid waste, a 3% increase for wastewater utility charges, and no increase for water utility rates. I am going the wrong direction, it appears. There are a number of items that have been referred to budget. They are included in your package. In general, they're around concerns associated with playgrounds. There were concerns raised with respect to Brenham Park, Ravenswood, and Eaglewind. They've been addressed in your package. There were marine concerns related to marine archaeology and marine access. Both of those have been addressed through projects that have been included in the special operating project package. North Shore Restorative Justice Society, there was a request for information or to have that included, and that has been added as a service level change. And lastly, there was a request for information around Coalition for Healthy School Food, and that has also been addressed in your packet. There are a number of council inquiries over the past, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4 workshops. And so coming out of those various workshops related to service level changes, we've included a workforce capacity review summary and IT staff business case. In addition, we are asking for council recommendation on the youth council admin support. With respect to special operating projects, there were 4 special operating projects that have been added, and included in your package is additional information explaining the nature of the real estate facilities master plan public engagement. We've added one capital project as requested, and we've provided additional information with respect to the small tote, which relates both to the change in pricing structure and also a note with respect to council's question around I know exactly what this is. It's around the promotion of tote exchange and the timing thereof. So the recommendation is that that be promoted in conjunction with the billing cycle. That is the end of this presentation. And at this point, we will open the floor to discussion. I should note that we did not include in here a quote, a resolution that perhaps we should have with respect to the youth council admin support, because we do require a decision from council as to whether they would like to include that or not. Otherwise, we're open for comments and questions. And at this point, I will stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody. Yeah.
Council, questions? Council Pengill and then Council Race, then Stoner.
Thank you. Just somewhat related to the youth council amount, we also, I think, was it last week, recommended that the seniors advisory group continue. Would that require similar funding, or do we already have funding set aside, or would that group not need similar funding?
Any takers? And I'll just follow that up by saying, like, we have committees like ADP, they're not listed here separately. And so when we do strike new committees, how do they get absorbed into operating budgets over time? So similar to Council Pettengill's question, we approved a new seniors advisory for the rollout of the recreation programs. So how does that work? Go ahead, Ms. Arthurs.
Thank you, Mayor. When it's a council-led committee, Legislative Services has budget to absorb that. When it's a staff-led committee, it is up to the individual department to make sure that they have the budget included. Because it was the recommendation coming from Recreation, I would make the assumption that they have thought about that, and their costs are going to be low related to committee, and that they will be able to absorb it within their existing, the same as Mr. Buxton has done with the Smoke Buff Committee. He just absorbed that within his area. There is no cost related.
So on another topic then, thank you. Just the $150,000 for the fit out of the youth center. I'm just wanting to understand a little bit what exactly that is. We did have a youth center. I think the new space is a bit smaller. So in my mind, there's a lot of sort of what I would think of as fit out stuff that we could just bring across. In my mind, a youth center, they tend to be not so less institutional and more a little bit rough, and kind of, you can tell that kids and teens have been there, and that's kind of the aesthetic, and maybe that's not what we're going for here. I'm just sort of trying to understand though what exactly we need for this new space.
Through the chair, to address your question, Mr. Pettingill, Recreation is currently in discussions with Sea to Sky Community Services about what they anticipate will be in that space. And so at this point in time, I can't answer that question specifically. I do know that they there is an intent to bring additional information back from those discussions to council at a future date. So this currently really is realistically is a placeholder to allow us to support whatever decision is made at that time.
Okay, thank you. And I think my last question for now, the 30,000 for storage when we lose the Arts Council building, and I appreciate that being put in there. But I want to make sure that we've understood exactly what the needs are. A key piece is the Ampton the Park equipment, I believe, in activating that park. But as electronic equipment, it's, I believe, temperature and moisture sensitive and so on. So just want to make sure we're clear that the security and the temperature environment sort of control is going to be sufficient. And if we can't achieve that, then maybe we don't spend the money, or maybe we need to. So I'm just wondering if we've had those conversations to make sure this gets us, solves the problem we need to solve.
Through the chair, to address your question, Councillor Pettingill, on two fronts. One, based on the nature of the equipment that would be stored there, we would have a discussion with the Arts Council and with the operators of the park to ensure that we can address whatever specific requirements they would have. I know that I think I just saw Mr. Bragg. And I should also note that I see Mr. Paisley on the line who might be able to better address your questions with respect to the youth center. So if you will give him a moment.
Mr. Bragg,
Through the
did you want to
chair.
go ahead?
Yeah, through the chair. Good morning, Mayor and Council. Thank you. Yeah, very quickly here. The answer is yes, we agree. We haven't talked to the Arts Council about the specific scope of work and the specification here. We placeholdered the $30,000 knowing that it's we're pretty close to what we can get for them. So we need to dive in and get further detail from them to make sure that the product is exactly on point.
Mr. Paisley, did you want to comment on the youth center further?
Through the chair, thank you. Just to further add to Mr. Russell's comments, at this point, our acting director of recreation is meeting with Sea to Sky boundary manager, and they're looking at what the space would look at in regards to the youth hub and what the requirements are for furnishing it in regards to activities that may take place within it. So we're in further discussions with them, and we'll bring forward specifics in the future to council what may be needed with that 150,000. But as Mr. Russell confirmed, at this point, it's simply a placeholder, and we'll bring details forth.
Ms. Glende, I saw your hand. Did you have anything to add at one point?
Thank you, Mayor Elliott. No, I was just pointing out that Dan Paisley was able to answer that question. Thank you.
Councillor Race and then Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. I'm looking at the first page of attachment 1, which is the financial plan summary working copy for the general fund. And I just had a couple of kind of formatting questions. First of all, I was given a correction page, which changed the general taxation number significantly for a couple of years, the last 3 or 4 years. And so I was just curious if that was just an error or whether there was some different information that we're applying to that. And it also changed the transfers to and from other funds numbers on that same page. And so maybe I'll just stop there just to see if we could just clarify where those changes came from.
Through the chair, to address your question, Councillor Race, the original package that went out had an error with respect to the tax amounts in the years 23 through 26, and it had overstated tax and understated transfers from reserves. So the pages that replaced it were to correct that. And, you know, we're going to ensure that as we progress through the remainder of our deliberations, that we're working through some mechanics of the new process that we're using to apply tax stabilization. So we just need to make sure that what's appearing on the page is in fact correct. So I think that the first one We thought it was right, but it was not. So this was a correction.
Thank you. And I got into this a little bit when I was looking at this yesterday. And so the calculation is wrong because I was just looking at that same schedule and I looked at the year 2026, which has got a different revenue number. But the question that came up in my mind is we talk about our borrowing capacity being limited by our revenue. It's a percentage of revenue. And so then there's a number of different revenue numbers. And so I was wondering whether it's the general taxation number or whether it's total revenue, which in this example is about $10 million higher. And the other part of the fraction would be the principal and interest payments. And that's straightforward enough as the numerator, I'm assuming. But I was just wondering what we use as the denominator in that fraction.
Through the chair, Councillor Race, the answer to that question is it is the total rather than just the tax amount. So it does include other funding sources such as utility revenue and revenue from the rec center, for example. So those items are also included.
And so in this number, or this schedule rather, for 2026, that works out to where taxation is 41.8 million, total revenue is 51.3 million. So it would be based on the $51.3 million number.
I'm going to say yes because I'm not looking at the schedule, but I'm actually thinking in my mind that that number should be a little higher because I believe our utility revenue is somewhere in the range of 17 or 18 million dollars by then. So I'm thinking that number should probably be closer to 60, not 50.
Yeah, that may be. This is just the general fund schedule. But the last question on this, just kind of as a larger picture question, is the transfers to and from other funds. And it raised the question in my mind, do we have targets each year for how much we want to contribute to surpluses and the various surpluses? And because these come out of taxation, essentially. It's money we spend, tax money we spend or transfer as opposed to using for a direct expense. And I was just curious if we had targets or where these numbers came from.
Through the chair, there were targets that were developed late in the last decade. That's my understanding. And we were moving towards those targets, and I think that there were roughly $2 million for transfers to capital and $2 million for $2 million transferred to the capital reserve and roughly $2 million to pay for capital projects. We did get, shall I say, slowed down somewhat by an event in 2020 called COVID. So we kind of backed off on the amount of capital expenditures that were being funded from taxation. So there are some numbers that we have been using sort of as a rough guide to where we are attempting to move. As Ms. Boxford, our CFO, has mentioned before, we are in the process within finance of doing a review of our various reserves, and we anticipate that we'll be coming back to council in first quarter next year, roughly, with a review of where we've gotten to with that reserve review, and from there we should be able to provide some specific targets as to what we think is appropriate. That's also being done in conjunction with the work that you saw earlier this year around our capital modeling, which allows us to add future projects in past the 5-year plan so we can see what other items are coming our way. So we need to be able to combine those two pieces of information to flesh out more effectively what our longer term targets should be. And that work is underway and will be coming to council soon.
Yeah, I think he'd be referring to the long-term financial plan, which is about 2010. I was here for that. I've forgotten all the numbers, but that was actually my comment was, might we be revisiting some of these targets in light of our capital plan and so forth? And you've answered the question. Thank you.
Councillor Stoner and Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. A few questions, just building off of Councillor Race's question. Is it possible to increase the transparency on the list of reserves that we do have and how much is in them? So for example, I'm thinking of the affordable housing reserve, and we're looking to allocate 150,000 out of that reserve this year, but I'm unclear how much is actually in there. Like, is that going to drain the entire reserve, or is that 1/10 of it?
Through the chair, Councillor Stoner, there's approximately $1.2 million in the affordable housing reserve. The reserve draws to support affordable housing that are presented in the current budget. We'll use about $200,000 of that, so that should leave about around $1 million left. With the package that was included for capital that was presented on October the 26th, I believe that I will get the number wrong with respect with which enclosure, because it's like a 57-page document. We did include a reserve continuity schedule in that package, I believe, as enclosure 7 or 8, one of the two.
Thank you. And then two other questions. On the component around the real estate facilities master plan communications plan, appreciate the additional detail and the breaking out in across 2 years. I still have some concerns though on how staff envision progressing the discussions beyond what's already been completed with these stakeholder groups. And so I guess I'm just curious if staff can speak a little bit more. The library already has completed their future needs study. We have the Brennan Park Fields and Lands Master Plan that's ongoing, and I'm not entirely sure where that project sits at the moment. We have the results from the re-envisioned Brennan Park from 2018 that kind of directs what the priorities are there. And so how do we see those conversations really progressing, and how will engagement actually help that at the moment, given we know what the timing and the scale of investments needed? And so I'm concerned that we're going to kind of bring these groups in at this point, and we actually won't really be able to progress much because we know that we've already committed to some significant other projects, and we don't really have the financial bandwidth to add more. So I'm just curious what staff envision those engagement sessions really progressing in those discussions.
I see Ms. Moore is on the line. Did you want to address this, Ms. Moore?
Hi, good morning, Council. Through the chair, I'm happy to address it, or I'm not sure if Mr. Plum is on the line and would prefer to address it based on his previous conversations with the stakeholder groups. But if not, I can try.
Can you hear me there, folks?
Yes, we can.
Okay. For some reason, my video is not coming on, but oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, and I think this maybe, Christina, we can sort of work on this one together, but you know, we did have an open house meeting just this week, and we were able to engage with some of the user groups, and one in particular. And where we are right now is Councillor Stoner is correct in listing all this work that's been done, and there's a lot of work that had been done in the real estate and facility master plan previously around putting cost estimates on facilities from a financial planning perspective. But we feel like where we are right now is we need to move forward in the next year and really clean up and shore up the scope of what these actual facilities would include. So the library needs assessment did identify potential needs in the future, but there's been lots of conversation around what a library / community center / hub could look like in the downtown. And so one of the things we want to do is really flush out what could be included in that facility and come up with updated cost estimates in 2022 dollars to understand really what the magnitude of those projects are, and working with the user group that's in the community that's most impacted by that. Same thing with the projects at Brenham Park. Like we've got numbers in the master plan that are a few years old and on scopes that haven't necessarily been vetted out fully with the user groups. So what we really see happening in 2022 is an opportunity to sit down with all the stakeholders and really shore up those, what I'll call the scope and costings of those projects, so that we can understand how they may fit in the financial plan going forward. And so I had a conversation with, in this particular situation, the ICE user groups, and expressed this potential approach, and it seemed to resonate with them. And Christine, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Thanks, Neil. The only thing I would add is just really to echo that last point. I think, you know, we are hearing a lot from the user groups and the participants and the citizens that are keen to see these projects moving. And we do see that that conversation and engagement with them through this next year, as Mr. Plum mentions, can really, you know, hone in and define that scope, but also really make sure that we are keeping the residents engaged and ensuring that we're having conversations to get us to the next place when there is the opportunity to, you know, to move forward with funding, grant applications, etc. So, you know, we think it's a great first step to get these conversations in the community. We think that they will be well received, and then it really puts us on a better foot to move forward when we have funding opportunities.
To follow up on that, I guess you haven't actually identified the user groups, but the folks that I hear from the most, and I think are quite vocal, are folks who want a second ice rink, who want additions to the pool, that have been identified as lower priority based on the real estate and facilities master plan. And we had come up with a proposal to try and scope public-private partnerships to try and advance that work, but council hasn't seen anything in terms of where that has landed. And so are there opportunities for funding that we're not currently aware of, or are we still kind of in the funding is when the grant is available and we know that we've prioritized the wellness center for the first grant that we received?
So in terms of the scoping, we still feel like it's important for us to nail down what these projects are going to include, and that will enable us to look forward for and potentially move forward on funding opportunities as well. So that's a big part of it going forward as well. So I'm not sure, Christine, if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think that's really the crux of it. You know, when we did do the Brenham Park engagement in 2018, there really was sort of an equal level of interest across the 4 projects that were proposed and that were discussed between the second rink, the second pool, the wellness center, and then the broader upgrades. There wasn't a lot of conclusive evidence to demonstrate that one project, you know, moved further ahead than the other. And I guess the understanding from the real estate and facilities master plan is that the Brenham Park projects and the library projects have been equated equally in terms of growth projects. And so, you know, moving these conversations forward with all of the different groups, allowing us to do this background work is still seen as valuable, even though there isn't sort of an immediate funding mechanism at the, you know, kind of at the ready to pull, to move forward with any one project.
Okay. I will think on that for a little bit. I do have one other question, but it's unrelated, so I'll go back to the end of the list, Mayor.
Well, I don't mind if you continue, but I might follow up on your line of questioning. So council a few years ago, when we did the original engagement around Brenham Park, was presented with a financial options around creating a specific tax for recreation, creating memberships, looking at sponsorship, looking at creating a foundation, there were all these unique ways in which we were going to explore providing funding for Brennan Park outside of just grants. And we haven't seen any progress on that. And also, what you're talking about sounds like conversations with user groups, which would seem to fit in staff time. And so what is the $20,000 really for? So where are we at with all of our exploration around financing Brennan Park? And then what is the $20,000 for? Because it sounds like we just want to have some more conversations.
Neil, do you want to speak to the funding part, and I can speak to the 20,000 part?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to part of the funding part. I haven't been involved in a lot of the discussions around the foundation and those types of things from a fundraising perspective. I'm not sure if anyone from finance can help with that. In terms of like private partnerships, and Councillor Stoner brought that up earlier as well, that's something that we would be exploring through the process with the user groups as well as we're working through the scope. And so that's something that we do, and we've already, Mr. Bragg and I have started to have we've had one conversation with a private entity that could potentially fund something there just at an explorative level to see whether there is even any viability there. So it's something we are live to, and on the private partnership side of things, that's something we'll explore this year as part of our funding analysis as well. And that's where I can't really speak to the other part about the foundation aspect of things. And maybe Christine, if you can just speak to the 20,000.
Thank you. In terms of the work on sponsorships and a potential foundation, the combination of COVID and as well staff leave have meant that that work has not moved forward to the extent that we were hoping up until this date.
And Ms. Moore, what do we need the $20,000 for?
So the budget ask, as mentioned in the memo, you know, this is still, we are still quite preliminary in this process in terms of being in the early planning process for 2022 and for what we can achieve with public engagement. What we really wanted to do was to keep the conversation going and to make sure that that the community was engaged through the process and through and help us to formulate some bigger questions for the broader community when the time comes. The 20,000 was, you know, what we looked at the original budget ask that we had put in was 60,000, as council is aware, and that was really just as a placeholder based on previous engagements that we had done prior to us really being able to drill into what the planning actually was. We knew we would need some funding for it. So this revised proposal asking for 20,000 in year one and then another 40,000 in year two. The 20,000 is based on some similar conversations we've had, and I'll refer to the recent seniors 55 plus engagement where we hired an external facilitator to come in and facilitate some of the conversations. And we felt that if we had some budget allocated to this project in 2022, use of a facilitator could be really helpful, especially with some bigger conversations, perhaps with the arts and culture user groups and special interest groups, as well as potentially the recreation groups. Yes, some of the meetings will just be conversations, but others may really benefit from having an external facilitator, and that's what the 20,000 would be allocated for over the course of the year.
Okay, Councillor Stoner, did you have another question? Go ahead.
I did. And it's just on the parks and playground requests. And I'm curious if there's a specific staff member or department who's responsible for reviewing and prioritizing the requests. Going through the budget package, I see that we're moving forward with the sales at Eagle Wind Park at an estimated cost of $55,000, which I have a question about the price tag there. But there are a number of other requests around Brennan Park Playground, one at Eagle Run Playground, which haven't been prioritized. And so I'm just curious about the process of how we allocate funding across the community for playground and play structure requests.
I can perhaps try and address that question. With respect to parks prioritization of parks planning, we don't actually have someone or where that particular function resides. So between some of the planners and myself, we cover that function. It's based largely on the Parks and Recreation Master Plan, which identifies the existing communities that are in need. So we've had Dentville on the books for the last few years. The amount next year was to cover that, finishing off that part. The next one that has remained below the line this year was one in North Yards, and then we would likely move to look at other communities, whether or not that would be Ravenswood or would be one of the other communities. So we're using the Parks and Recreation Master Plan to which has a list of communities, neighborhoods, sorry, that are in need. So we're working through those. So that's largely what guides the priority that we're putting in front of council. Now, your question with respect to the sales.
Yeah, so I guess with that context, if I remember the Parks Master Plan correct, it didn't actually envision any covered structures in parks, which I do see as important, but how is it that we're now allocating $55,000 for a sale in one park when there are still neighborhoods that don't have access to playgrounds, or such as Brennan Park, which is below current standards?
We'd understood that to be a request of council, and we'd had a number of requests for sales over play structures. We selected Eagle Wind as the first option. We've not tendered that price out, but we have asked a couple of suppliers, and that's the price that we're getting on them. That includes materials delivery and installation. So there's concrete work and some minor structural work. So that's why it's pricey. We understood that there was a desire both on council and the community to see summer cover, shade cover for play structures.
Yeah, I think that's correct, that there was that desire. I'm just curious how it gets how that desire gets weighed against the already long list of requests for playground construction, but I guess that's the budget process and our decision.
Yes,
so thank you.
The sales are, let's say, in that ballpark. A new playground or structure is probably at least double that, if not 3 or if not 4 times that amount to get a reasonably good play structure into a park. So it sort of it fits a little into sort of the in-between projects. So.
That good, Councillor Stoner?
Thank you.
And is that sale, Mr. Buxton, the covered structure, is that going in the line item for covered structures, or is that a separate line item?
I believe it's in the covered structures budget, and Mr. Russell could confirm that.
Through the chair, that is correct.
Right, so that'll come with the 150,000 that's in this year's budget. All right, Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. I'd like to make some observations and also a suggestion regarding the Real Estate and Facilities Master Plan Public Engagement Budget Request report. And this is a report collaboratively produced by Christina Moore Communications, Neil Plum Real Estate, and Cal Bragg Facilities Planning and Construction. And I wanted to especially take a second to compliment it. I find that this report, particularly under the section Further Considerations of Staff, to be very thoughtful, perceptive, I believe, and also useful in its comments and considerations. Council is receiving letters, and we've sort of alluded to it in the conversation already, from the public regarding some initiatives. And I think we can relate the considerations in this report in addressing some of those citizens' concerns. I also appreciate the reference to the IAP2 framework, and I think it's always useful to remember that and refer to it. and in what we are doing here and in public engagement. My suggestion I'd like to make is in some of the phrasing used and would be used ongoing in this engagement effort. Under the phase 1, I'll quote, facilitate conversations with direct stakeholders, including, but not limited to, the arts community. Now, Ms. Moore has already referred to arts and culture, and this is my point. I think we should replace arts with culture. And this is something that Whistler does. John Ray, manager of cultural programs, is very articulate and careful on this point. That is that arts, heritage, and performing arts are subsets of culture. And this can be a sensitive issue. Right now, we have an arts council with a very broad mandate, and we refer and depend on that arts council with respect to that mandate. But its membership and its directors do not reflect that broad mandate. And so it's an ongoing discussion within the cultural community as to who's who and how we refer to them. And in this engagement, I suggest we should use culture. It's all-encompassing, and it reminds us to be all-encompassing, including heritage, performing arts, and diverse activities. Arts tends to be, in the public mind, visual arts. And in fact, it's a bit of a habit to only think of visual arts or to emphasize it more than maybe is appropriate. So that's the suggestion for phrasing. Use culture, cultural programs, cultural facilities as all-encompassing. With respect to the Wellness Center, I think it's important that we remind ourselves that the Wellness Center will or can potentially host cultural programming and cultural spaces. And that when we do outreach and engagement regarding the Wellness Center, we keep this in mind. After all, cultural groups have been part of Brennan Park and Civic Center planning and fundraising since 1974, very vocally, not least from the theater community. And so we can be perceived to some extent by the cultural community that they are a little bit forgotten, or maybe their interest may be obscure with respect to wellness center investments. Moving on to, a couple of final thoughts. It's my view, and I've said it again, and this won't be the last time, that the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Strategy cultural spaces planning action items are being delayed too long, and that this is impractical. And those action items are 6.3, planning for cultural spaces, 6.4, setting targets. And I am in fact interpreting the report in front of me here, this budget request engagement report, as a little bit of a measure of recognition that this is the case, that we need to get going on this cultural spaces planning. Finally, maybe we need to look forward to undertaking a more detailed recreational facilities master plan, and Councillor Stoner has alluded to this topic as well. The Recreation and Parks and Recreation master plan is now 10 years old, and the one before that was very different than the present one, starkly different, and maybe the future one will be again. Maybe we need a recreational facilities plan in future that will look more like our active transportation or our paving plan. And I know that Mr. Buxton and his team are going through the parks in our areas and doing detailed work. But maybe we're looking in future to doing a renewed Parks and Recreation master plan, now 10 years old, that will be a little bit different, detailed, and more useful to us in work planning and budget planning. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Councillor Reyes.
Thank you. And this is a follow-up to Councillor Stoner's question and Councillor Anderson's comments. I think it was last term, it was the Brennan Park facility plan. I tend to get these plans mixed up from time to time, but I think it was that plan that identified sort of 4 stages of renewal and expansion of Brennan Park. And the first was sort of a general lobby facilities upgrade. But the key ones were the wellness center, the second ice rink, and the addition to the pool, which I initially thought was maybe just 2 lanes to make it an 8-lane pool. but was later persuaded that the most efficient thing is just to add a whole new pool to the complex. And those were ranked. The recommendations out of that report were the Wellness Center, which dealt with programming, would cover the greatest need at that time in recreation, which was programming space, and then the ice rink, and then the pool in that order. So this $20,000 that we're talking about for me was more of some public engagement around downtown community hub and what that might include when we're talking about a library, possible community center type facilities, arts and culture facilities, or culture facilities, things of that nature, and what might go in there and how we could sort of cost it and possibly even, where it might be located or where it might not be located. So I think if we're going to go back and revisit the Brennan Park plan and start adjusting that order, or if we're getting into a situation which I'd hoped with the capital plan we would avoid, of saying it's the downtown hub versus Brennan Park, one or the other, then I think $20,000 will be nowhere near sufficient. And we would have to consider quite a bit more money. I'm not advocating for that. I think we want to confine our discussion at this point to a visioning of what that downtown hub might be and what might be included in it, and then cost, and go forward with that. But and once again, hope that we wouldn't put ourselves in a position of saying it's either the downtown hub or Brennan Park, but not both. My hope from the capital plan is that by having the option to lease a city hall space, we've left open the possibility of doing both the downtown hub and significant improvements to Brennan Park more or less concurrently. But we'll just have to see where that goes, I guess. But if we are going to broaden the scope significantly, then I think $20,000 is nowhere near sufficient.
Mr. Russell, when you first presented the budget several meetings ago, what was the tax revenue increase on existing properties? We're currently sitting at 4.06%, but where did we start?
We started at 3.9%. So it's gone up by $60,000, which equates to just under 0.2%.
Thank you. I was trying to understand from the feedback we got about Brennan Park and the inadequate playground there, about where that fits into the Brennan Park Lands and Field Master Plan and where that would get funded. Because I don't believe we have an answer for those folks that have written to us about where this fits in. So there's no timing in there. I wonder if someone could enlighten me.
I'm looking for Mr. Buxton to assist us with some enlightenment, please.
And I was hoping that Mr. Plum might be able to help, but I must admit I'm not altogether familiar with the location of the playground in that master plan. But I think that the problem is that we don't want to, at this point in time, produce a new playground there that may or may not be consistent with our long-term plan at Brennan Park. So I think we need to get some clarity on that, where all the individual elements are going to go. Then we can think about a new playground at that location. But we don't want the cart before the horse, so to speak, with a playground potentially being in the wrong place.
If you'd like me to add to that, my understanding is the Brennan Park Land Master Plan will be coming back to council probably in December. And there was a version of it that was brought to council earlier this year, and council asked for more work to be done on it. So my understanding is coming back, and I believe items like this will be where locations of these things will be kind of worked out in that plan. I can't speak to where any improvements like that might fit in the capital budgeting side of things, but my understanding is though that any final discussions around that type of changes to the land there will be covered off in that plan.
So I'd like to move that we defer the REFMP public engagement for consideration in the Q1 scheduled budget update. And if there's a seconder, I'll explain why. Seconded by Councillor Stoner. So to me, there's still a number of holes in the Brennan Park plan. So one, we were supposed to pursue these sort of creative financing options, and that work's not done. And so I think it's premature to engage stakeholders because we didn't add any of the Brennan Park projects to our 5-year capital plan. We are focusing on the 2 fire halls, the public works yard, a park satellite, and we added the transit maintenance facility and something else. But it's nothing to do with Brennan Park, except for maybe if we get a grant to do the retrofit and the upgrades. And so I don't feel like the plan totally makes sense to me to go back and re-engage on topics we did just a few years ago. And I get that the dollars have gone up for sure, but there's holes in our knowledge about how we're going to fund this, where it goes, what's the timing for the Brennan Park lands master plan, how we're going to fund that. So the whole Brennan Park precinct doesn't make sense to me yet. And I don't want to even commit $60,000 to doing more engagement until we do the homework we've already directed staff to do. That makes more sense to me than getting people's hopes up again for projects that don't appear in our 5-year plan at this point, because we've had to prioritize other core facilities. So I would rather delay, give staff a chance to reconsider all these different threads that are related to Brennan Park, and develop a more cohesive plan, and then consider that based on whether our non-market change is higher or lower than we thought in the Q1 update. But to me, right now, this level of engagement without those other pieces completed, it doesn't make sense to me. I just feel like we're going to ask people for information that we can't deliver on in the short term at all. Any other comments? And I get there's a piece there for the library, but I also think the library could fund that through their budget. Councillor Rice.
Well, I'm not going to support the motion. My hope would be that this $20,000 would not deal with Brennan Park at all. Because as I say, we did study that. We did create or adopt, I guess, a recommendation that there's a certain order to improvements. And while I acknowledge that some of these other things that were mentioned, almost as side comments, I don't think they came forward as serious proposals to consider foundations and other funding mechanisms. To me, Brennan Park has always been, and the timing of it has always been conditional on grant funding. And we've applied twice for funding for the Wellness Center and been turned down both times. And that's dictated why, for me, it has not started yet. We have a grant application in for the general upgrade, which I don't believe would go ahead if we don't get the grant. So I think that that's kind of where Brennan Park is, and we've figured that out. And I doubt the needs in the community have changed that much that we would want to upset the order of what we thought was appropriate in the last term. For me, this $20,000 is something that is something needed now, and that is a vision in the community for what the downtown community hub might look like. It's not just the library. I'm not advocating just for the library. To me, it's a very critical part of our downtown development. And so I don't see the need to change that or to delay that at all, and would prefer that to go ahead as budgeted presently. So I will not be supporting the motion.
Councillor Pettingill.
I will support the motion. I guess my recollection of what this public engagement was, partly because we'd been doing a lot of work on the real estate facilities master plan. We wanted to make sure the public was up to speed on what the timelines were, what the challenges were, and have some of those discussions. Take the mayor's point, though, there's a fair number of outstanding issues, which I think we need to go through. And from my perspective, we've had, updates from Helping Hands and so on about other competing needs in the community. And so at the very least, thinking about who needs to be in these conversations and what are some of these other missing pieces is important. With respect to my colleague, I don't disagree with the value of doing some engagement on downtown, the library, and that sort of thing. I just don't believe that's what we are talking about for this money for. And so it's not clear in my head that that $20,000 is just transferable and meets the mark on that other piece. So I guess I would prefer to maybe hear back in Q1 about what exactly is the engagement we need to do and what do we need to get it done properly. Thank you.
Councillor French, then Hereford.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll be supporting the motion, and my main motivation is just looking at the number that we started at of 3.9% as an increase, and we're now at 4.06%. As I mentioned last week, every time we put 20,000 more into the budget, we just creep those numbers up. So I support the motion. Thank you.
Councillor Hereford, then Anderson.
Thank you. I'll be supporting the motion. I'm supportive of the initiative, however, to accomplish all the wide-ranging goals that have been batted around this $20,000. But it's not clear enough to me where this is exactly going to be targeted, and that I think does put it on the cusp, which is essentially what we're discussing here with the Q1 update, just to really understand where we are, and perhaps at that time the ask can be more focused. And I do appreciate that staff broke this into pieces, but I'm still not all the way there yet, and that'll give a bit of time to really understand the picture as far as the final numbers go all around with the budget and potentially the focus of this particular piece of funding. So I'll be supporting the motion this time.
Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. I will not be supporting the motion in that I think that Councillor Race is painted a picture that there is a fairly clear pathway at Brennan Park. There is a fairly clear ordering of facilities expansions. We have a pretty clear idea about our constraints. That is, we're dependent on grant funding. Now that may open up. We don't know. And we have a good pool of experienced people behind some of those facilities. And I think of the Minor Hockey Association, they're chomping at the bit, and they have a very good resource people for fundraising. I have spoken to the Wellness Center and the fact that there's some diverse considerations that might be considered there that maybe need attention. However, this does not compare for me with our planning needs and our engagement needs for the downtown hub. This is new territory, exploring that cultural facilities oriented downtown hub. Not only cultural, of course, we're looking at other, yoga and what have you. But I think that the engagement need and the backlog of work is much more important at the downtown hub. Thank you.
I'll call the question. Any opposed? Councillor Race, Anderson opposed. Motion carries. I would, council, like to deal with the youth council. So this is a bit of a weird budget ask because it was proposed as an outcome of the youth council or the youth strategy in 2018. And then staff began that work. It was put on hold through COVID, and now it is something being driven through I guess, through the mayor's office, but I'm enacting it on behalf of the youth strategy. And so I brought it to budget because it doesn't have a home like ADP or the seniors advisory. So no one owns it. There's no department that owns it aside from my office at this point, but you can't run a committee without a budget. And so I don't want it to appear like this is my ask to council. It is an outcome of the youth strategy that can't exist unless it has some support and some budget behind it. So I don't know if staff have a suggestion on how to make sure this is sustainable and where it should live so that it's not under threat every time it comes into the budget each year. But I'd like to think that it gets fit into someone's department because it should outlast me and the next mayor and the next mayor. And right now, that's not the structure that's before us. Right now, it's a special project or a special ask, and it's at the will of council. So, so I guess I'm going to ask for your support this year to support it, but also to staff. How do we make this live on? Any advice?
Through the chair, the appropriate process would be to include a service level change request, which has been done. I guess as a little background with respect to this service change request, which might provide a little additional information for council. The calculation that is presented there is $25,000. That consists of two components. One is for the logistics aspects of the youth council, which would relate to things like food and beverage for meetings, bus passes for transportation, things like that. It's roughly $10,000. The other portion was a calculation based on additional support for the youth council to pay for, say, honorariums or to bring in consultants to facilitate their meetings or facilitate some of the things that they may be asking for. So one way that council may wish to approach this is to phase in that $25,000 potentially over a period of time. So like biting off a portion, including it this year, and then perhaps addressing an amount in a future year. With respect to where should it reside, well, that's a big question, but there is a council budget, and right now it's been on this specific youth council has been aligned. The support for the youth council has been aligned with the council budget. If it was felt that it would be more appropriate to have that aligned per se with, say, legislative, with corporate administration, we could move that. So I think at the end of the day, it's really within the organization, within the administration, who would be the point person on that. And I believe at this point in time, it's anticipated that and I will do my best to pronounce your name correctly, Jeremy V. There, I'll leave it at that. That way I don't mispronounce your name. Appears to be the point person for this, and he represents mayor and CAO. So I think the appropriate alignment is with council, the council budget. But if council has concerns with respect to this, they could phase in the introduction. See, Ms. Glende has additional comment.
Ms. Glende?
Thank you. I think there's some confusion. The Youth Council Administrative Support has been proposed as a service level increase so that it will be embedded in the budget year over year. But the title above it says projects for consideration. So that may have confused the reader.
That did confuse the reader. All right. So, yeah, Councillor French.
This reader's still confused. What if this youth amount goes ahead, if we push it forward, does that cause an increase in the 4.06%, $91 a year?
Yes, it does. It would cause an increase of approximately 0.1 or $1.75.
Councillor Anderson?
Two comments. I actually can't put together a picture of how exactly we spend $25,000 per year on a youth strategy. I'm not saying I'm skeptical, but I will just admit to being curious. But the other point I'd like to make, and it has been brought up, I believe, by Councillor Pettingill, is keeping in mind the picture of our community, a senior strategy and a potential seniors council, a seniors initiative. In fact, the Senior Center Society found earlier this year that there was good grant money available for a community senior strategy. In fact, it's a grant program. I believe it's federal. I'd have to refresh my memory. It comes back each year. And so this was something that the Senior Center Society related to me that they had pursued a proposal, an application. It wasn't realized, perhaps more additional discussions within their organization and perhaps between their organization and the district staff and council might have been helpful, but it wasn't completed this year. But I'm sure, I have the feeling that they're confident it can be done, so that with respect to balance, seniors, youth, there are grant programs out there, so I'm not overly concerned about an imbalance because there are opportunities that have been identified by the seniors for the seniors, and I just wanted to cover that point. Thank you.
Councillor Race?
Yeah, I think it is appropriate to put it in the budget. I think it's been one of the common themes of the last council and this council that we engage youth, get them involved in decision making, get them involved in local government, and make them aware of local government and what it does. And so while the program at the moment may not be exactly laid out, for me, that is a relatively small amount of money to invest in this initiative. And I think I'm happy to do that, and we just take it year by year and see where it goes. And I'm sure it will evolve. We don't have a strategy. We just got a council, a youth council. So I think there will be certainly an evolution, but I'm happy to support that.
All right, so maybe I'll put a motion on the floor that the service level change for the funding for the Squamish Youth Council be incorporated into the 2022 to 2026 financial plan. Seconded by Councillor Race. Any further comments? Call the question. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Council, any other questions on this? Yeah, Councillor Race.
Thank you. It was more just a matter of the format of the schedules attached to Schedule 1. And I'll just pick one as an example. Protective services. And I look at, which is about the third page of that. I look at the revenue, which is straightforward enough. And then I look at the expenses, which is police, animal control, and building inspection, which totals apparently 11.467 million. But the three numbers there, police, animal control, and building inspection, probably, when you just look at it, roughly add up to just over $7 million. And so I'm trying to reconcile what's the difference between those three and what's called total expense. And that's a common thing in these schedules, that the numbers that are listed don't add up to what's called quote unquote total expense. And so there's some other number in there. And I'm just, if the public is looking at this, they might wonder if we can add or not, but it's not clear what other expenses might be involved. And I can understand there would be other expenses. It's just that they're not enumerated, even in a lump sum basis, to get those numbers to balance. And then also with that specific schedule, I wondered why the fire department wasn't there, for example, if that is protective services, or are they somewhere else?
Through the chair. I'm going to suggest that we I'm just going to hang on for a second here, Ms. Glende. I'm going to suggest that we replace that schedule. That's clearly incorrect.
Did we get it working?
Through the chair. To address your question, Councillor Race, it would appear that there were some lines that were hidden in that document prior to it being published. There's clearly the value of protective services is in the $10 to $11 million range. It does include fire and police as two largest components. So if police is not showing up on that page, that's clearly incorrect. So administration will prepare a new schedule and provide that to council.
It's actually, in this particular instance, it's fire that's not showing up, but it's a common theme throughout the various pages of attachment 1 that the items listed as expense items don't total what is called total expense. And it looks like when I first looked at it, I thought, well, there's only 3 or 4 big items and there's a whole bunch of other stuff, which I can understand get quite minute. But even just to have a number there so that public can see other expenses or something of a general name, just so that the numbers add up. It was just a little bit confusing to read it. Thank you.
Through the chair, on behalf of staff, I apologize for that error. We will provide a corrected schedule to council.
In one of our earlier budget meetings, we were looking at whether there was any restart funds we could redirect to mental health in the community. And I didn't see that in the budget documents.
Through the chair, can you hear me? Yeah. The restart grants will be reporting in our Q3 variance report. We're still collating how much is left from this particular year in savings. We can bring that back after year end. We do feel that there will be savings over and above what was budgeted. So council will have the opportunity to use those funds in the Q1 amendment.
Okay, could we put a placeholder then in the budget so that we don't forget that, please?
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Buxton, you were away last time, but we discussed amping up the support for the affordable housing. I see that's in the budget this time, but maybe perhaps you can elaborate on how this additional funding will help us catch up on some of the work we wanted to do on the affordable housing governance structure and getting another project off the ground.
Yes, we've proposed that the full amount that to run the society for a full year be included in the 2022 budget. Previously, we'd sort of proposed a more ramped up or phased in increase to the budget. What that will allow us to do immediately is either contract resources, either sort of an executive, not an executive assistant, but some form of assistant. There are a lot of administrative tasks in terms of getting the society actually up and running, finding office space, recruiting an executive director, recruiting directors. All of that's going to take some time. So we can use the additional funds to bring somebody on stream immediately rather than partway through the year to plow through some of those tasks of just logistically getting a new organization up and running in as early as possible in Q1. So we will start everything earlier and get contract resources, or the society will hire someone immediately just to get the work rolling right off the bat.
Thank you for that. And then, Mr. Bragg, are you still here? There. The covered structures, we've built a number of large structures, but there is a place for sort of smaller, more discrete structures that include benches with back support. And like, I think about some of the seniors who use our park benches, often near the library, up near London Drugs. And picnic tables don't really suit because there's no hand holds to get up and down. And also those sort of benches aren't covered. And I wonder if there's scope to look at not only these large structures, which I see people using, which is great, but also sort of Whistler-esque, they're little A-frames that are in the village, but more accommodating people who might be in wheelchairs or people who need back support, or just want to sit with one or two people, not in a big structure with lots of people.
Through the chair, in short, yes, we can definitely do that. I mean, the ones that we've got in place at the moment do accommodate, in particular, wheelchair access as well. But we can definitely look at for the $150,000 budget that we've allocated next year for the smaller structures, definitely.
And is that something we're doing in consultation and collaboration with like our Squamish and the Placemaking Society? And I know we've had a few people approach us. There was a young woman who approached us about supporting covered structures for her grandfather. And I think they were looking for sort of smaller scale, more intimate kind of opportunities. But that would be part of this budget?
Correct. Yes, we reached out to the user groups, and this is our first year of doing the covered structures. We can refine them and get into more detail, in particular sizing for next year, definitely.
Okay, Council, do you feel this budget is ready to go forward for public engagement? Is there anything you would like to take above the line or below the line at this point? Councillor Anderson.
I will just note that there is a line item in the budget which, for understandable reasons, cannot be discussed in an open meeting at this time. And it is a fairly substantial line item, $200,000 from reserve funds. And even though it is reserve funds, it's something worth consideration. So I'll just note that we may have some further review and consideration of that particular line item. Thank you, and its implications.
Councillor Pagnol.
Yeah, just wanting to, I guess, set or understand expectations. And I guess at a personal level, it's just the way I think. I kind of feel like, okay, now I see the whole picture. It mostly makes sense. There's a few things I might want to tweak. Now's the time when I'd feel comfortable maybe sort of making some suggestions. But I also recognize there's been a whole lot of master planning and the OCP and staff work and work planning that's gone into this sort of complete package here. And so while I might feel like, okay, now I get it, now I would like to play around, I sort of understand why anything that might be suitable for something small, but for anything larger, that might be where I take that understanding and push it through into the next budget. And the reason I'm raising this is we are going to the public, I think November 23rd with some Q&A and so on. And so just wondering if we can have a bit of discussion on what the public should expect in terms of their influence. What is a sort of a small change versus a bigger change that might be more suited towards a subsequent year's budget. And then we've got this amendment in Q1 where we might make some adjustments also. So just wanting to help people and myself understand when changes might appear if people see things that they would like feel should be a little bit different.
Today is our opportunity to present to the public the budget we think is supportable. And it is great when we get full council support for a budget. That it is good to have a unanimous decision. So I think that it is preferable to make changes before it goes to the public and to put those motions on the floor now if there's things you'd like to change rather than debating them post public feedback.
So for clarity, yeah, I'm not thinking of proposing changes at this point for the reasons I said. I guess what I'm wondering is for the public going on the 23rd, what should they expect their level of influence be? Because we've received communication and we've shared our thoughts and so on, but we're going to get more feedback on the 23rd. And so, is there a way we can express to people that, hey, a smaller change, that's the sort of thing we can tweak, or a little bit bigger could happen in the amendment in January. Otherwise, these are things we would take as advisement for the following budget. And that's how we would incorporate the feedback. Just wanting to, I guess, dig into that a little bit.
Mr. Russell, are there any limitations on what we can change after the 23rd?
Through the chair, from a staff perspective, I have to say, no, there aren't. Unfortunately, I only say that because that's a lot more work if you do. But we'll be coming back on the 30th of November, I believe is the date that's scheduled with a package updating council on the responses from the public engagement evening. I believe it's the 30th. Okay. And so if something, if there was a lot of, resounding desire to see something move, council would be informed of that, and they would have an opportunity at that point in time to direct staff to change the budget prior to the budget being brought for 3 readings. The budget, currently we're looking at the financial plan being brought for 3 readings on December the 14th. So yes, there will be another opportunity, at least one, for council to make changes.
The summary sheet under 2022 new initiatives, I don't know if this part is going out to the public in the same way, but we've got the public safety services review, which sort of is intuitive. Then we've got a line item that says workforce planning, and then strategic leadership structure, and then one that says facility support staffing, and then one that says PW growth related, public works, I think. But those aren't sort of intuitive descriptions for the public. And so I think we need to just make sure whichever headings we're giving in some of these summary documents that we are not using acronyms, and that we either put little footnotes to describe what's in those categories, or we're pointing people to the information where they can get more. So we've had 4 budget meetings, so we understand a little bit better which positions or service level changes are incorporated into each of those. But I don't think we can depend on the public to know that SOP is special operating projects. So just that next phase, we've got to now think like someone who hasn't sat through 3 years of budget meetings, or 7 or 12. Doug, what are you on? I forget. So that would be my only suggestion as we go forward, as we simplify this for folks. Okay, Council, any last? Councilor Anderson.
Yes, two observations. One I've made already is that thinking about our engagement, public engagement opportunities in person, I believe we've had 2 years, successive years, where they've been hosted at the Ledge. And when we have people come forward or engage in conversations and then look for staff or try to orient the citizens as to the wall charts and line items, I've made the suggestion before, and I'll just say it again, that I think that it may be useful to arrange the line items, the projects, by department, rather than by master plan, or in addition to master plan project, organizational plan projects, organize them by theme. This is engineering, and these are the engineering staff that you can talk about these items there. Here's public works. And that may be a more intuitive way for the public to actually become acquainted and comfortable with these very detailed charts that our communications department does a better job every time out in arranging. But to make that information more approachable, perhaps we might think about that. Let's make it approachable. And one suggestion might be to group them by engineering, economic development, planning. Maybe in addition to other ways that we do present the information. I know that staff has presented the information in different formats to us in this year's package, which is helpful. The second point I want to make, having been, before I got on council, an attendee of the public information meetings over a number of years, I was always, and I wasn't alone, disappointed with the little time and attention the collected feedback received by council after the public engagement session. I remember thinking to myself, wow, that went by quick. Because after all, council receives a matrix, a package, a spreadsheet of comments received, and we don't. In fact, no councils ever do go through these line by line, which would be difficult, but even theme by theme or grabbing highlights, I think we should try as council to make an effort to be seen in the follow-up meetings, that we have noted these and as highlights or themes more than we generally do. We get this package, it's in a blue sheets or whatever that's prepared by the communications department. But we, in my view and in my experience, councils are not seen to be giving this feedback the attention that the public would expect. And this doesn't mean anything radical, but it does mean at least giving us time, give council time in the agenda planning to be able to be perceived that they're taking that feedback seriously and giving it discussion, at least highlights and themes. Thank you.
Okay, so the Councilor Herber has something to say before we go there.
Thank you. I think when we go for, I think it's November 23rd is to the public with this. Councillor Stoner mentioned it earlier, but that sort of transparency around the reserves, I think is something I'd like to see there. I know that exists somewhere. We have it, but I want to make sure that that's at the forefront. So the sort of the mystery of these reserves, can have the sort of the veil pulled back, so everyone can see what's there as they're proving useful as we go through this planning exercise. But so we understand the depth of them and the rough percentages we're using and so on. And so yeah, I just wanted to highlight that because that was very helpful when we saw that, and I think it could answer some questions. And I do think that I do expect the public to be asking, and rightfully so, about sort of the pieces that are driving this. And I know that the master plans will be on hand, and our strategic plan, and so on. So I'm not sure how best to or even how big of a room we would need to package this information all in a format that's easily consumable, but it should be available in some way during that event. And I'm looking forward to that event actually, and hearing what the community thinks of how far we've gotten so far. So anyways, I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Mr. Russell, just want to check. Are staff recommending that the small tote go up this year or be held this year?
Staff's preference would be that it go up. Council's wish is that it not go up.
What's currently reflected in the budget?
What's currently reflected in the budget is council's wish.
Do we need to, it's something that was on the floor. Councillor Herford asked it to be sent away to get information. All of us agreed that we should get more information, but we actually haven't voted on that change. We voted on sending staff waits to get information, and now it's come back and it's in the budget. So I just want to look around the room and confirm with my fellow councillors that you are agreeing with Councillor Herford that we should keep it the same versus the staff recommendation, which is to raise it by $10 this year. Because I do think we shouldn't just let that one go without a discussion. So if there's any hands, I'll take hands. Councillor Race.
Well, if I understand it correctly, if we leave that one where it is, and staff's recommendation initially was the $10 increase, where does the $10 increase get covered off? Does it not have to adjust on the other two or somewhere else in the budget to make the whole thing come out even? And is that already accounted for in what we see in front of us?
Through the chair, to address Councillor Race's question, the resolution was that the rate be set at $200 rather than $210. So we did the calculation. It works out to $18,000 and change, give or take. And we reduced the revenue stream in 2022 by that amount. And as a result of that reduction in revenue, that adjusted the transfer to reserve by the same amount. So reduced the transfer to reserve.
Thank you. I kind of agreed with the comments around it a couple of weeks ago now that we want to continue to incentivize the smaller totes, and maybe next year we might start. Inflation will eventually catch up with this program, but I'm happy to hold it for another year.
Okay. Councillor Herford.
Thank you. My hope is that we can hold this for this year, and I see the chart going forward in the staff report, and I think that's reasonable. And over time, as we have currently, we have 70% of the customers in medium totes and 27% in the small. I think that in future those numbers should be inverted, and I would expect at those, as we go through this over time, to make sure that the revenue matches. There will be maybe even further adjustments than what's laid out in this chart. But I think it's imperative that we get to sort of invert those numbers as a goal in my mind, and this is a reasonable way to move in that direction. But obviously, if 70% of our customers move to the small in this fiscal year, that's a problem. But maybe that's also a good problem as we push to reduce our input into the landfill and thus the life of landfill and so on and so on with the other goals. So I think it's appropriate to hold for now, but change is hopefully on the horizon there as well.
But just to confirm, we're not doing another special campaign. We're distributing the change with the utility bills, and people will change in September of 2022. Did I read that correctly?
That is correct. That is the proposal of staff.
So that's clear. Because last year we had a special campaign early in the year. Okay. All right. The motion before us that the District of Squamish proceed with public engagement on the 2022 to 2026 financial plan as presented in this report. Aside from the changes made today, is there someone put that forward? Councillor Pettengill, seconder? Councillor Stoner? You want to speak to it? Councillor Stoner? Go ahead, and then Councillor French.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank staff for, again, the process that we went through this year. I think it's important that we've moved up the budget process as we've talked about in the past. I also think the way that it has been presented has been clear, and appreciate, as Mayor Elliott said, the themes as we've gone over in each of the budget workshops and the tying it all together. I think where we've landed is a good place to bring it out to more robust public consultation. I know that it's been open for public consultation throughout this process, but I look forward to hearing from the public on where we've landed with this current draft budget. Thank you.
Councillor French.
Thank you, Mayor. And the key barometer for me is the percentage increase that our existing tax base is going to pay and the dollar figure that's associated with that. 4.16% is where we sit now. And for the mythical average valued home in Squamish, it's an increase in the year ahead of $92.75. Keeping in mind that for some people who don't fit into the averages, that those numbers might be significantly higher or significantly lower. While 2% for me is a sweet spot, we have ambitious things we want to accomplish that require money. And at this point, I can swallow 4.1.
I will be supporting the motion also, and I'll just add that a financial plan, and in the detail that we have laid it out here before us and we've discussed in the recent weeks, is also a work plan. It's the district work plan. And we should be prepared to receive and discuss the financial plan as a work plan with the public. A lot of the questions, or some at least, that will come forward won't be the budget issue in the detail or the big picture, but work plan related. What are you doing, district, about this or that? When do you plan to do it? So I think that we should all be mindful of that and consider that as being a natural part of the exercise we're engaging in with the public. Thank you.
Oh, Councillor Rice.
Thank you. And I'll be supporting the motion as well. I think I commend staff for quite a lot of work in this and a lot of vetting, I think, that we just don't see necessarily. To me, this is almost a remarkable budget in the sense that it only contemplates an increase of around 4%. Given the growth pressures that this community is under right now, which are unprecedented in scope and intensity, the demand for services, the need for services, the wish for more facilities and amenities. We have to balance all that to get it down to a number. We could certainly spend more. There's lots of things to spend money on. But I think this is a very good compromise for this time, for this community, and helps us still pursue a lot of these objectives. Thank you.
I'll call the question. Any opposed? Motion carries. Motion to close by Councillor Herford, seconded by me. Any opposed? Motion carries. And we have a different link for the closed meeting. So, yeah, 15 minutes.